When most people hear the word Viking, they imagine horned helmets, wild raids on monasteries, and bloodthirsty warriors sailing into the mist. That is the story that school books and movies have repeated for decades. But what if that picture is only half the truth? What if the real Vikings were far more complex, more intelligent, and more influential than the myths suggest? This is the story your teachers never told you, a journey into the hidden history of the Vikings. A story not just of war and plunder, but of explorers, engineers, traders, poets, and even philosophers. When most people hear the word Viking, they immediately imagine bloodthirsty warriors with horned helmets, swinging axes as they burn villages and plunder treasures. This image has been repeated so often in popular culture, movies, and even school textbooks that it feels like the full truth. But in reality, the story of the Vikings is much more complex, and much of what we know today is clouded by myths created centuries after they lived. The Vikings were not just raiders. They were explorers, farmers, poets, shipbuilders, traders, and lawmakers. They built some of the fastest and most advanced ships of their time, which allowed them to cross not only the North Sea, but also the Atlantic Ocean. Long before Columbus, they reached North America around the year 1000 AD, establishing short-lived settlements in what is today Newfoundland, Canada. What is rarely mentioned in schools is that the Vikings also created one of the earliest forms of democratic governance in Europe. Their Thing assemblies were gatherings where free men could vote, debate, and settle disputes without the need for kings or absolute rulers. In many ways, this system was more democratic than some kingdoms of medieval Europe. Even the image of Vikings wearing horned helmets is false. No archaeological evidence has ever confirmed this. The idea was invented in the 19th century, mostly for opera costumes and romantic paintings. Real Viking helmets were practical, usually made of iron or leather, designed to protect in battle, not to impress with horns. The truth is that the Viking Age, which lasted roughly from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century, was not just about violence. It was about survival, adaptation, and innovation in a harsh northern environment. It was about families who farmed the cold Scandinavian lands, men and women who crossed seas for trade and discovery, and a culture that left a legacy still alive today. In this story, we will uncover the real Vikings, the parts of their history that schools rarely teach, the hidden truths behind the myths, and the lasting influence of their world. When history classes mention Vikings, the focus usually falls on their raids across Europe. Monasteries burned, treasures stolen, towns destroyed. Yet, this was only a fraction of Viking life. Most Vikings were not warriors at all. In fact, the majority were farmers, craftsmen, and traders. A typical Viking household centered around a longhouse, a wooden building covered with turf or thatch, where the entire family, along with animals during harsh winters, lived under one roof. Inside, the hearth provided warmth, light, and a place for cooking. Daily life was demanding. Men farmed the land, raised cattle, and fished. while women managed the household, produced textiles, and often ran farms when men were away on voyages. Contrary to the stereotype of Vikings as dirty barbarians, archaeological discoveries tell us that they valued cleanliness and grooming. Combs, tweezers, razors, and even ear spoons have been found in graves. The word Saturday in English, coming from laugardag in Old Norse, literally meant washing day. Vikings often bathed at least once a week, which was considered extremely clean compared to most Europeans of the time. The Vikings were also skilled artisans. They crafted jewelry, weapons, and tools with intricate designs, often decorated with patterns of animals and gods from Norse mythology. Wood carving and shipbuilding were especially advanced. Their longships with shallow keels could travel both in the open sea and shallow rivers, giving them an enormous advantage in exploration and trade. Food was another essential part of daily life. Their diet included bread, porridge, fish, meat, and dairy products. Honey was used to make mead, a fermented drink that played an important role during feasts and celebrations. Social gatherings were not only about food, but also about storytelling, a way of passing history and legends from one generation to the next. What schools often forget to tell us is that Viking society valued law and order. They were not just wild raiders. They had complex systems of justice. Disputes were often settled peacefully through fines or compensation, rather than endless blood feuds. Their assemblies, called things, gave people a chance to speak, argue, and vote. It was a society that believed in balance between freedom and responsibility. When we look at this side of Viking life, we see not only warriors, but also builders of families, communities, and traditions. They were survivors of a tough climate who found ingenious ways to thrive.
Well, if you only rely on popular culture, it seems Viking women were either helpless victims or exotic shield maidens who fought alongside men. The truth, however, is far more surprising. Women in Viking society had a degree of independence and influence that was unusual in much of medieval Europe. From a young age, girls were taught practical skills essential for survival: spinning, weaving, food preservation, and managing a household. But their role was far from limited to the home. When men left on long voyages, women became the heads of farms and estates, responsible for finances, trade, and negotiations. Legal evidence shows that women could inherit property, request divorces, and even reclaim their dowries if a marriage ended. Compared to their European counterparts, Viking women had more legal rights and economic freedom. Some women indeed took up arms. The sagas and legends mention shield maidens, female warriors who fought beside men. For a long time, historians dismissed these tales as myths, but modern archaeology has challenged that view. In 2017, researchers confirmed that the famous Birka warrior grave in Sweden, long assumed to belong to a man because of the weapons buried with the body, was actually the grave of a woman. This discovery proved that at least some women not only lived as warriors, but were also honored for it. Marriage in Viking society was a partnership. While men often arranged marriages for political or economic reasons, the bride's consent was important, and once married, the wife controlled the household's wealth. The keys she carried at her belt were a symbol of her authority over the home and its resources. Religion also reflected women's importance. Many Viking goddesses, like Freya, the goddess of love and war, or Frigg, the goddess of family and destiny, embodied both strength and wisdom. Women also played a role in spiritual practices. Seeresses, known as Velur, were highly respected figures who performed rituals, predicted the future, and guided communities through their connection with the spiritual world. The presence of strong, independent women challenges the common idea of Vikings as a purely male-driven culture. Instead, it reveals a society where women had voices, responsibilities, and opportunities, a truth that rarely makes its way into textbooks.
When schools describe Vikings, they usually focus on raids and pillaging, but this paints only half the picture. While some Viking expeditions were violent, many were peaceful, centered around trade, alliances, and diplomacy. In fact, much of the Viking world relied more on commerce than on plunder. Vikings built vast trade networks that stretched across Europe, Asia, and even into the Middle East. From their homelands in Scandinavia, they sailed rivers deep into Russia, establishing trade routes along the Volga and Dnieper. They traded furs, amber, honey, and slaves in exchange for silver, silk, spices, and glass. Arab merchants recorded encounters with these northern traders, often describing them as tall, fair-haired, and meticulous about cleanliness. Their settlements were not just military outposts, but also bustling marketplaces. Towns like Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden became centers of commerce where goods from all over the known world could be found. Viking silver hoards discovered by archaeologists prove how interconnected they were. Many coins in Scandinavia came from faraway places like Baghdad or Persia. Diplomacy was another tool the Vikings mastered. They forged alliances with local rulers, sometimes marrying into royal families to secure peace or trading privileges. In England, for example, Viking leaders often signed treaties with kings, creating temporary peace that allowed both sides to prosper. Some Vikings even served as elite guards for foreign rulers, the most famous example being the Varangian Guard, an elite unit in the service of the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. These warriors were so trusted that they became the emperor's personal bodyguards. The Vikings were also settlers. In places like Normandy and France, they established permanent colonies. The very name Normandy comes from Northmen, a reminder of its Viking origins. Instead of endlessly raiding, these settlers integrated with local populations, adapted to new cultures, and often became rulers themselves. Rollo, a Viking leader, was granted land in Normandy in 911 AD, and his descendants eventually included William the Conqueror, who changed the course of English history in 1066. What we rarely learn in school is that Vikings were not just destroyers of civilizations, they were connectors of civilizations. Their ships carried not only warriors, but also goods, ideas, and technologies across continents. They were part of the first true global trade network of the medieval world. Every great civilization has its rise and fall, and the Viking Age was no exception. By the mid-11th century, the world was changing rapidly, and the conditions that once allowed the Vikings to dominate were fading away. One major reason for their decline was the spread of Christianity across Scandinavia. As kings converted, they enforced the new faith, replacing old traditions with churches, bishops, and centralized royal authority. The independent, clan-based structure of Viking society gradually gave way to kingdoms more similar to the rest of medieval Europe. At the same time, Europe itself was adapting. Coastal defenses improved, towns grew stronger, and armies became better organized. The surprise raids that had once brought the Vikings easy victories were no longer as effective. The element of fear that had made them so powerful began to diminish. Internal struggles also weakened them. Rival clans and ambitious leaders often fought one another, draining resources and dividing communities. Viking culture valued independence and local rule, but this same spirit made large-scale unity difficult. Yet, while the Viking Age ended, their legacy only grew. They left behind more than fear and destruction. Their shipbuilding technology influenced naval design for centuries. Their trade networks laid the groundwork for connections between East and West. Their laws and assemblies inspired early democratic practices that would later resurface in European governance. Even their language survived in unexpected ways. Many everyday English words like sky, egg, window, and knife came directly from Old Norse. Place names across northern England, Scotland, and Ireland still carry traces of their presence. Culturally, the Vikings left behind the sagas, epic tales of gods, heroes, and voyages that continue to inspire modern books, films, and art. They gave the world legends of Thor and Loki, Odin and Freya, tales that still live today in comic books and Hollywood blockbusters. Perhaps most importantly, the Vikings changed how we think about exploration. They crossed the North Atlantic centuries before other Europeans dared. Their settlement in Vinland, modern Newfoundland, Canada, around the year 1000 AD, marks the first known European presence in North America, a story largely forgotten in classrooms that still focus on Columbus. The decline of the Viking Age was not the disappearance of a people, but the transformation of their world. They became farmers, kings, Christians, and traders in a Europe that was itself evolving. But their impact never vanished. If the Vikings were more than raiders, if they were explorers, traders, lawmakers, and poets, then why are we rarely taught this side of their history? The answer lies in who wrote history and how it was preserved. Most of the written sources about the Vikings come not from the Vikings themselves, but from their enemies, monks, priests, and rulers whose lands were attacked. For them, the Vikings were not neighbors or traders. They were terrifying invaders. Monks who saw their monasteries burned had little reason to describe Vikings as skilled farmers or democratic leaders. Instead, they painted them as godless barbarians, agents of chaos who threatened Christian Europe. This image stuck for centuries. Later historians, especially during the Middle Ages, repeated these stories, ignoring the peaceful and creative aspects of Viking society. By the time schools began formalizing history lessons in the 19th century, the image of the horned, violent Viking was already deeply rooted. Romanticism in the 1800s added another layer of distortion. Artists and writers reshaped the Vikings into larger-than-life figures,
wild warriors in horned helmets, singing in operas or starring in heroic poems. While this created powerful myths, it buried the more ordinary but equally fascinating truths. The women who ran farms, the merchants who crossed continents, and the poets who kept wisdom alive through song. There is also a political reason. History is often told in ways that glorify certain nations and demonize others. For Christian Europe, it was easier to portray the Vikings as uncivilized raiders rather than acknowledge that they had forms of democracy, equality for women, and a global trade system long before much of Europe did. To admit that would mean admitting that barbarians sometimes lived with more freedom and progress than so-called civilized kingdoms. Today, archaeologists and historians are uncovering a different story, one based not just on biased writings, but on evidence. Ships, tools, jewelry, settlements, and even DNA. This evidence tells us that the Vikings were far more than the one-dimensional characters we learned about in school. They were complex, innovative, and deeply human. By rediscovering their real history, we learn not just about them, but also about ourselves. We see how myths shape education, how power controls memory, and how entire cultures can be simplified into caricatures. The truth about the Vikings is a reminder that history is never just what we are taught. It is also what we must seek for ourselves.